Simply put, simply put.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of the Simply Put podcast, where we discuss difficult topics in simple terms with extraordinary people. First, I'd like to welcome on a very, very special person who would probably humbly describe herself as just a teacher from Iowa who decided to do the right thing and do it again and again. But she's done some amazing things in her career. She's been on Oprah 5 times, The Tonight Show. She's been on the list of 30 notable educators with Confucius, Plato, Booker T. Washington, no big deal. She's done diversity training for General Electric, Exxon, and IBM and AT&T, to name a few. She's lectured the FBI, IRS, U.S. Navy, the U.S. Department of Education, and U.S. Postal Service, and directly impacted hundreds of thousands of lives. Mrs. Elliott, welcome to Simply Put, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, you're most welcome. I'm delighted to be invited to do this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I didn't realize that I had done all those things with all those people. And if it was so important, why are we still in this mess?
Wow. Okay. Yeah, you're getting right into the real stuff. Let's start with the first question. So you've dedicated your life to educating people about racism and discrimination, starting in 1968 with your third grade students in Iowa. Everybody who knows about you knows about the Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes experiment. So what exactly sparked that creative idea, and why did you decide to just go and do it?
Number one, it wasn't an experiment. It's illegal and unethical to experiment with people. But when you call it an experiment, that downgrades it to something I shouldn't have done. It was an exercise in empathy. It was my attempt to have my third graders understand why Martin Luther King Jr. was out in the street, what he was protesting. It turned into much more than that, because what it did was it taught me more than it taught them, because I had had 33 years of practicing racism. They had only had 9 years, so they weren't nearly as far ahead in how to do it as I was. It was Martin Luther King Jr. had been one of our heroes of the month in February, along with George Washington, who owned slaves, bought and sold people for money, Abraham Lincoln, who refused to free the slaves until he absolutely had to. He had been one of our heroes of the month, and I had taught them that he was a hero because all he wanted to do was make life better for all of us. He wasn't about making life better for Black people. He was about making life better for all of us. And he was all about hope. For me, hope is an acronym for holding on to positive energy. And that's what he did until they shot him. He held on to positive energy. He thought he could make a difference. When I found out that he had been killed, it literally rocked my world. I thought the world had stopped turning when my sister told me over the telephone that we'd shot Martin Luther King Jr. And I still can't say it without getting sick to my stomach, because he was such an important figure for the future of humankind. He wasn't working for the future of Black humankind. He was working for the future of humankind, all of us. And I knew that we were studying the Indian unit, and I was going to have to go into my classroom the next day and explain the killing of Martin Luther King Jr. to those kids. I was ironing the teepee that my previous third graders had made. We were going to put it up in the classroom the next day. After I'd fed the kids and put them to bed and washed and dried the teepee and put it on the living room floor, and I was watching intelligent, sophisticated, educated, pale-faced males interview leaders of the Black community. And one of those men said to 3 leaders of the Black community, when our leader was killed, his widow held us together. Who's going to keep your people in line? And I thought, my God, does he not realize what he just said? When our leader, in other words, JFK was the leader only of white people. His widow held us together. See how civilized we are? We can be held together by just one little woman. Who's going to keep your people in line? As if this was a subset of humanity, and you couldn't depend on them doing the right thing. I was furious. So I changed the channel, and there was another educated, tall white male asking 3 leaders of the Black community, don't you Negroes think that you should feel sympathy for us white people because we can't feel the anger at this killing that you Negroes can? And I thought, oh my God, how can he not feel anger at the killing of this man? I rolled up the teepee, I unplugged the iron, I threw the teepee into the bottom of the closet. I got my husband's supper. I told him what I was going to do the next day. He said, Jane, you're going to lose your job. I said, if I lose my job for doing the right thing, then I'd rather teach somewhere else. He said, nobody will ever hire you again if you do what you're talking about. You won't be teaching anyplace else. I said, so be it, Daryl. That's the way it is. I'm going to do the exercise. And before I went to sleep that night, I said the only prayer I ever said at that time was, oh, Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Oh, Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. I said it over and over like a mantra. Within 15 minutes of doing the exercise the next day, I found out you better be careful about what you pray for. You might get it. If I hadn't said that prayer, maybe I wouldn't have learned what I learned about myself the next day. And what I learned about myself was pretty ugly. The kids came in, the first student came in, Stephen Armstrong, said, hey, Elliott, they shot that king last night. Why'd they shoot that king? I said, we're going to talk about that, Stephen. So first we did what you have to do the first thing in the day. You had to say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag with the words under God in it, which do not belong there. Then we sang God Bless America, so we broke the law twice, because God Bless America is a good song to sing. It's easy and it's simple and kids love it. And then we started to talk about the killing of Martin Luther King Jr. And we talked about racism, and we talked about unfairness, and we talked about slavery, and we talked about all those things. And I could see these kids weren't learning a thing. And I finally said, do you kids have any idea how it would feel to be treated, how it would feel to be other than white in this country? No. Would you like to find that out today? Yeah. It was like we've already gotten out of spelling and handwriting. Keep this broad talking. We don't have to learn anything all day long. Kids do that from the time they enter school until the time they get out of graduate school. I said, okay, today we're going to judge people by the color of their eyes. And since I'm blue-eyed, and most of the students in this room are blue-eyed people are going to be on the top the first day. And they said, what do you mean? I said, I mean, blue-eyed people aren't as smart as brown-eyed people. They aren't as clean as brown-eyed people. They aren't as civilized as brown-eyed people. You give blue-eyed people something nice, what do they do with it? And those kids said automatically, they'll wreck it. They'll tear it up. Well, why would they do that? Because they don't know any better. Why don't they know any better? Because they're blue-eyed. And at that point, little brown-eyed Debbie sitting in the front row looked up at me and said, how come you're the teacher here if you got them blue eyes? And I thought, oh my God, there it is. There it is. Now she has the power to challenge the teacher. This 9-year-old can challenge me because she knows how to be a racist. I was absolutely shocked. It had never occurred to me.
And you taught it to them in seconds.
Yes. And then blue-eyed Alan Moss in the back row stood up and said, oh, Debbie, if she didn't have them blue eyes, she'd be the principal of the superintendent. They're both brown-eyed. And I thought, good Lord, look at what he's doing. He's defending me, and I'm wrong, and he's defending me as a member of his race. Not as his teacher, but as a member of his race. If my eye color makes me inferior, then his eye color might make him inferior, and he has to let everybody know that it's not true, that brown-eyed people, I couldn't do it. I couldn't believe what was happening. And then it got worse. I let the brown-eyed people sit in the front of the room. The blue-eyed people had to sit in the back of the room. Blue-eyed people weren't allowed to go play big playground equipment because, they'd fall off and get hurt because they're clumsy. Brown-eyed people could do and be and say whatever they wanted to. The blue-eyed people had to go last in the lunch line because, blue-eyed people take too much if you let them go first. All the things that we have applied to people of color in this country, particularly black, I applied to my blue-eyed students that day. And those brown-eyed students immediately began to live up to my expectations of them, and the blue-eyed students began to live down to my expectations of them. I created a microcosm of society in my 3rd grade classroom, and I found out a whole lot about me and a whole lot about those students in that classroom. I had 4 dyslexic boys in my classroom that year. They could not read or spell accurately until the day they had the right color eyes. And on that day, those brown-eyed boys read words I knew they couldn't read, and they spelled words I knew they couldn't spell. And at the end of the day, Billy came up and said to me, Mrs. Elliott, where's my spelling paper? I said, what do you want it for, Billy? He said, I want to take it home and show it to my mother. She thinks I can't spell, and I can. He didn't find out until April 5th of his 3rd grade year that he could spell. And he didn't find out that he could because he had been living down to teachers' expectations of him until the day I told him he had perfect eyes, and then he became what he should have been all along. He cried and I cried because I was so furious at what we have done in the education systems in this country. On the other hand, I had in my classroom that day Carol, the Lutheran minister's daughter. She came into my room in February reading at the 6th grade level. Had a steel trap mind. I've never taught a child any more brilliant than that one. She's tall, blonde, blue-eyed, pale face, just the perfect so-called American girl. I taught her how to multiply the first 15 minutes of math class. She had never multiplied before. On the day she had the wrong color eyes, that child forgot how to multiply. She made mistakes in reading, she made mistakes in spelling, and she walked with her shoulders hunched when she walked across the room as if to ward off an expected blow. She should have done that because at recess time, I found out, 2 brown-eyed Debbies and a brown-eyed Cindy stepped up behind her. One of them reached up, struck her across the back with her forearm, and when Carol turned around, Debbie said to her, "Now you have to apologize to me for getting in my way because I'm better than you are." And Carol apologized and came in crying. That would never have happened if I had not introduced racism based on eye color into my classroom. And make no mistake about this, the kinds of things that you see happening between people of color and we pale faces would never have happened if we had not deliberately introduced racism into this society. We introduced it into this society to make lots of money for pale faces, and to use people of color in order to make money. And that's what makes racism work today. It is an economic plus for those who have the power. And if you don't believe it, if you don't believe it, you aren't thinking very well. I was shocked at what was happening in my classroom. I went down to the teacher's lounge at noon. I was going to stop the exercise after lunch. Went down to the teacher's lounge to share with the other two third grade teachers what was going on. I walked into the teacher's lounge. There were a number of teachers there, including the other 2 third grade teachers. I told them what was happening in my classroom. I needed some support from these Christian educated women. When I finished telling them what was going on, the younger of those 2 women, she's about 52 at the time, said, "I don't know how you have time to do all that extra stuff. It's all I can do to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic." Well, she hadn't taught reading, writing, and arithmetic as far as I was concerned, because if you think that reading, writing, and arithmetic are the 3 R's, you need to look at the spelling of reading, which begins with R, and writing, which begins with W, and arithmetic, which begins with A, and stop calling it the 3 R's. I was just disgusted with her anyway. And then the older of those 2, when I had finished listening to that comment, said to me, "I don't know why you're doing that. I thought it was about time somebody shot that son of a..." And nobody frowned, and nobody gasped, and nobody said, "Helen, do you realize what you've just done?" Every one of those teachers either smiled or laughed and nodded because she had expressed their feelings perfectly, and as the most senior member of the group, she had the most right to do so. At that moment, I decided no person of any age will ever leave my presence with those attitudes unchallenged. I may not be able to change your attitude, but I can challenge your attitude. And I will not tolerate people to make racist statements in my presence. Go on.
Do you know where any of these students or peers of yours, other teachers, where they're at today in their beliefs?
Oh, well, most of the teachers are where they belong. Jane, shut up. Most of the teachers have gone on to their dubious reward, quite frankly, and they know now whether they're going to be surprised when they get there and Jesus isn't white. My sister was substituting. The English teacher came down and said she's furious about something happened in the classroom. My sister said, "What happened?" She said, "I used the N-word, and one of my students said, we don't use that word in this school, and if you're going to continue to use that, I'm going to go out in the hall until you stop." And she said to my sister, "What would you have done?" And my sister said, "Well, I think I'd stop using the N-word." My former students wouldn't allow that kind of behavior to be in their presence. That's a tremendous plus for me. My father was a farmer, a poor farmer who raised 7 kids. He raised 6 kids. He produced 7 kids, raised 6 on a hardscrabble farm in northeast Iowa. Was one of the most moral people I've ever known in my life. The first film that was made in my classroom was made by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. I took that up to where my father and mother lived in the hotel. We owned the hotel. And I showed it to just the 2 of them. After it was over, my father, at 59, stood up, took his red handkerchief out of the back pocket of his blue bib overalls, blew his nose, wiped his eyes, and said, "I wish somebody had taught me that when I was 9 years old." Now, he refused to listen to a racist joke after that. He refused to be around people who were going to tell racist jokes. And if somebody would start one in his presence, he'd look at him with that Lloyd Jennison look and say, "Are you going to tell that story? Do you really believe that?" And if they kept on, he left the room. He wouldn't tolerate it. He wouldn't put up with it. He changed his attitude after he watched that film. Now, we don't have to see black men being killed to teach people that it's wrong. We could see little white children for living through a day and watch it for half an hour and realize that what's happening to black children is wrong. And we don't have to show that black man being killed over and over and over for the last 3 weeks, unless we're doing it in an attempt to intimidate black males and their mothers. I think it's time to stop showing that, because what must it do to a 4, 5, 7, 14-year-old black male who sees that young black man on the ground with those 4 policemen killing him deliberately? What does that say to young black males? I want to know what you think it says. And I think it says, be careful, or because we can get you. I'm just, the steps that we have taken backward in the last 3.5 years are so gigantic and so ugly and so unacceptable that if that fact alone, what that's doing to black children, if that alone isn't enough to change the leadership in Washington, D.C., there is no hope for this country. If that fact alone doesn't put a stop to this, then you can write off the future of this nation as a democracy.
How do you respond to people who say they don't believe racism exists or that it's just a myth?
A black person once said to me, denial is not just a river in Egypt. It's what we white folks, we pale faces, do on a daily basis. We deny that it's happening, because if we admit that it's happening, then we have to do something about it.
Right.
We don't want to do something about it. The majority of pale faces in this country don't want to do something about it, because in their heart of hearts, where they don't want to admit it, they know that it's a moneymaker. Lots of communities would like to have a prison come to their community, because that means 300 jobs immediately if you get a prison in your community. Why wouldn't you want to have a prison in your community? Particularly when you know that most of the people who are going to be incarcerated are black males. And that way, they're where many white people really feel they belong. And they really feel that way because the education system in this country has failed the people that they're educating. And the reason for that is educators need to be re-educated. You see, the educators believe the myth of racism, the myth of race. They believe that there are 3 or 4 different races, because nobody has ever sat down with them and say, look, here are some truths that you folks need to know. You need to read this book, Sapiens. You need to read this book, because it is a brief history of humankind. And it tells you the truth about skin color, which is that we all have the same ancestor back there between 300,000 and 500 years ago, and that ancestor was black. Every teacher must be required to read this book, The Racial Conditioning of Our Children, and the subtitle is Ending Psychological Genocide in the Schools. Nathan Rutstein. Now, the book was written by a Baha'i, but you have to realize that you get past, if you're a Christian, you go past the Baha'i stuff because it's too true and you don't want to do that. So you kind of ignore that, but you realize that what he's saying about what happens with children of color in schools in this country today is true. The only way we're going to change this is insist that every teacher, the least we can insist that they do, is just get a copy of this magazine. See these 2 children? Are they biracial? Are they biracial? No, they aren't biracial. You haven't been listening. There's only one race on the face of the earth. They are not biracial. They are both the same race, which is the human race. But you see, we have been conditioned to believe, well, these kids must be biracial because one belongs to one race and the other belongs to another. No, they both belong to the same race. It's the human race. We've got to get over the idea of several different races. There's only one. If you don't expect teachers to do anymore, at least expect them to read this magazine and this page. That is a map that shows where human beings began and where they moved from where they started. Those black modern human beings left the area around the equator and populated every landmass on the face of the earth. And as they moved farther and farther from the equator, their bodies, which had produced up to that point a lot of melanin because they were exposed to a lot of sunlight, they were exposed to less and less sunlight, so their body, their skin, their hair, and their eyes got lighter. That's the only reason my skin is light brown and yours is dark brown, because my ancestors moved clear up into the northern area here. That's the only reason we have different colored skin on the face of the earth. It has nothing to do with being members of different races, and it has nothing to do with being God's chosen children. Now, if you don't do anything else, put this on the walls of classrooms. This is pictures of different human beings, different colored people of different skin color, and each of them has a number according to the Pantone color wheel. So have this on the wall, or have the Pantone color wheel on the wall, instead of that ridiculous map that I suspect that you've seen that's on everybody's wall. Instead of putting the Mercator projection map on the wall, put this on the wall so that kids can walk up, put their hands up against the color, and decide which of the numbers on the color wheel match, which number matches of color matches their skin. And I said that to a group of people one day, and one was a teacher, and she said, I don't want to be known by a number. I said, wait a minute, do you pay into Social Security? Well, yes. Well, that's a number. Does that bother you? Well, that's different. No, it's no difference. We're all members of the same race, the human race. We teach racism in the schools on a daily basis. Now, get a picture in your mind of the map of the world that you see in the classroom or behind people who are reading the news on television today. Get that picture in your mind. Remember what it looked like? You see Greenland hanging down in the middle of that map like a great big ripe plum.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Now, that map was made in the 1600s when the person making the map was told by the Pope, as I understand it, to make a map that showed the spread of Christianity. So Greenland is huge, but if you look at the legend at the bottom of the map, on the legend it says, South America is actually 9 times larger than Greenland. Did you know that?
I don't believe I did.
South?
9 times larger.
Well, 9 times larger than Greenland. Do you think that's an important fact?
It seems like a pretty important detail to miss.
It must be pretty important because, you see, not too many months ago, our cheerless leader wanted to buy Greenland because it was huge, because he hadn't seen this map, which is the Peters projection map. Now look at Greenland on this map. Look up, right there's Greenland. Look at South America. Now, is that an important fact?
Yeah, I'd say so, for sure.
I'd say so. I'd say that's a very important fact. Look at the size of Africa on this map. If you know anything about cartography, you would realize that you could put several countries into Africa because of its huge size. But if you use the Mercator projection map, you don't have to tell the truth. You just tell the kid, put that on the wall, and kids now, and of course on the Mercator projection map, the United States is in the United States. The United States is in the middle of the map. And the one that I bought when I started doing this, there was Russia on one side and Russia on the other side to keep the United States in the middle of the map. So you had 2 Russias, 2 Chinas, and 2 Indias, and to keep the United States in the middle of the map. When I took that map apart in front of a group of record company executives, an older man in the back row, white man, stood up and said, "Now, lady, you've gone too far." I said, "What's your problem?" He said, "Now you've taken the United States out of the middle of the map." I said, "You know something? You didn't even feel it when it happened, did you? Are you upside down now? Are you upset now?" He was absolutely furious that I would disturb his image of his country's greatness and of his own greatness. We've got to do, if you don't do anything else, we've got to take the Mercator map out of the schools and put in something else. And the Peters projection map works beautifully as far as I can see.
It's amazing how much of racism is simply perception. Just over time, it's indoctrinated. It's really just how people think of themselves.
But it isn't simple, because we have put it in place and we have worked hard to keep it in place. It takes a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of ignorance to write social studies textbooks that are, in fact, anti-social studies. It takes a lot of time and it's taken how many years to have Black History Month? So we have, there are 20-day teaching days in a month. So we have 20 days in the year for educators to be forced to teach about Black history. And for most people, Black history in this country starts with slavery. There were Black people long before we brought them here as slaves. You need to read, if you haven't read Anthony Browder's book, Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization, for God's sake and for your own sake and for the sake of your children and your nieces and nephews or your brothers and sisters or the people you communicate with on a daily basis, read that book and realize that Blacks were doing cataract surgery with metal instruments before there was such a thing in Europe or the Middle East. You have to realize that we have the people who write the textbooks believe in the myth of race. It's the reason they write the textbooks the way they do. They have been conditioned to the lie. We don't call it a lie, we call it a myth. If you haven't read this book, for the love of God, get it and read it. And you'll realize that our laws are written by people who believe in the myth of race.
What can we do practically on a person-to-person level to begin re-educating people and really starting to undo the damage that has been done for hundreds of years?
I'll just tell you what you should do. Go to my website, janeelliott.com. Download these pages, learning materials, printed learning materials. Go through the typical statements. For instance, angry minorities make me feel so helpless. Have you heard some white person say that? Other ethnic groups had to struggle. Why is it so different for the Blacks? These are the kinds of things white people say all the time, and they have no difficulty saying them, and they expect people to understand that we didn't really mean it to be racist. Have them go through these, put an X before those statements that represent your present beliefs, and an O before those that represent previously held beliefs. Then after you've done that, after you've read through all these things, for instance, this one, I'm not racist, but when it comes right down to it, I wouldn't marry a Black person. Well, let me tell you something. If you're a human being, you can't marry somebody who isn't Black, because every human being on the face of the earth is a descendant of those first Black ancestors. So it's not possible for you to marry somebody who isn't Black. But have them go through that, and then have them go through the clarifications of those statements. What the person hears when he or she hears them. There's nothing wrong with what the preacher says or does. It's only in the minority group members' perception. If people say to Black people, I just don't understand what you're saying. And you don't understand what I'm saying. Well, yeah, I have a feeling that when somebody says, I wouldn't marry a Black person, they understand what we're saying. And when some person walks up to me and says, I'm biracial, and I say, oh, which of your parents came from outer space? They immediately know that they best not be calling themselves biracial in front of me. And when some white female says to me, I'm colorblind, I don't see color, I say, I knew that before you said it, because if you weren't colorblind, you wouldn't wear that shirt with those pants. And they take exception to that. It's all right for them to say that they're willing to ignore the largest organ on my body, inch by inch, which is my skin, in order to get along with me or my friends who are of a different color. Until we start responding negatively to this nonsense, as long as you go along to get along, you'll be accepted in society. I haven't been accepted in society for a very, very long time, nor am I sorry about that. Now, there is in that set of printed materials a set of commitments to combat racism. If these people really care about what's going on, they download those commitments, they read through them, they put yes, they check yes for they have done, no for the ones they haven't done, and then at the end of that, they go back, check one, circle one that they check no, put the date beside it, and decide to do it for a month. We can change what happens in this country. For instance, have I been investigating and evaluating political candidates at all levels in terms of their stance and activity against racism, sexism, and ageism? If you check that, yes, you're either lying or you didn't vote. If you check no, you're telling the truth. And that's the reason we have a fool in the president's residence today, because we haven't been doing that. We haven't been actively investigating what these people are saying when they say they want to be president of all of us. They don't want to be president of all of us. The one who's there now wants to be a member of the business roundtable and have the business roundtable people keep him in place. If you haven't read Robert Reich's book, The System, who rigged it, and how to fix it, you'd better get it and read it. And if you haven't read When at Times the Mob is Swayed by Bert Newborn, you'd better get it and read it, because that will tell you why we have what we have in the president's residence and why we are continuing this racism in this country. Racism is a moneymaker. Think of the people who will make less money after they stop privatizing the prison industry. During Clinton's reign, we decided to privatize the prison industry right after we put thousands of young black males in jail because of 3 strikes and you're out. Now think about what we did with those young black males, and think about what this president did not too long ago when he let 3 men, Flynn, Cohen, and Manafort, out of prison, even though they had been found guilty of what they were accused of. Let them out because we didn't want them to be exposed to COVID-19 in those prisons. Those thousands of black men are still in prison being exposed to COVID-19, and it doesn't matter, even though they went in on a plea bargain so that they didn't have a trial. Now, if you haven't read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, you better get it and read it. And you better do it soon, because the major problem in this country right now is the lack of education of the educators and the lack of the general public, so that we don't have to think. All we have to do is go along to get along. And we're going to take this country off the cliff if we don't vote in this election and vote in a sensible way.
You've mentioned multiple times just how you're the type of person who never wants to leave a conversation without challenging someone who said something that you just do not agree with. And you mentioned a lot of books. A few years ago, you published your own book. And in the beginning, you wrote a very heartfelt letter to your children. And you just talked to them about how it's just all these things that you've done has affected your life and caused a lot of people to just be at enmity with you. What is your relationship like with your kids now? Where are they at in their understanding?
Well, I have a really good relationship with my kids most of the time, but they're like children and parents. You know how that goes. If you don't, you should. My oldest daughter lived in Saudi Arabia, married to a Saudi Arabian, and her mother-in-law said, "Get those children out of this country, Sarah. This is not the place for those children. You don't want them to be raised here." And she was right. And because she didn't realize what a Saudi male is allowed to do, they can have 4 wives as long as they can support them. She didn't want to be one of 4. So she brought the kids home, and they're divorced, and the kids are absolutely wonderful. And you tell a racist joke around one of them, and your life is not going to be as pleasant ever again. My oldest son was the one who took most of the beatings while he was in school. His life was made miserable by the high school kids, by the teachers, and by the junior high kids who were bigger than he was. It was hell. He went through hell. But he got away. We moved away from Riceville. So after the principal's wife came to me, and she was teaching, came to me during a teacher's meeting one day before school started and said, "Jane, get your kids out of this school. These teachers are trying to destroy your children." So we moved, but I drove back and forth to school, and I kept on teaching there. But we got the kids out of the ugliness of being known as the sons and daughters of the town's only N-word lover. Life got easier for them, considerably easier for them after that, but they never forgot it. My 2 youngest, one lives in Murrieta, California, and is married to a lovely man, and they get along beautifully, and they have 2 children. She has 2 children, and her son is married to a young black woman who is absolutely gorgeous and brilliant, and that's fine with both parents. They're both absolutely delighted. My son lives not too far from here, just down the road from me, just far enough for him not to have to be here much, which isn't that he doesn't want to be around. It's just that I'm an old woman and he's not an old man, and he has lovely children, and they're happy and doing very well. But they refuse to go along with racism. They very quietly refuse to be tolerant of intolerance. And as far as I'm concerned, that's That is what I would have wished for them to be. They still hear the racist jokes, and they still have to claim that they're my children, but they just quietly refuse to go along.
Potentially fighting racism starts in the family structure, because you can see that your father, you told the story about your father, how he did not.
No, let me tell you where it starts. It starts in the delivery room. It starts in the delivery room. I talked to a group of registered nurses who want to be midwives. In fact, they are becoming midwives. And I said, why are you asking me to talk to you? I was delivered of 4 children in 5 years, but I didn't do the delivery. And they said, that's not what we want to talk about. We want to talk about the fact that we know, as registered nurses who have worked in delivery rooms, that brown and black-skinned women do not get the same treatment in delivery rooms that white women do. And we want to do the delivering so that people will be treated fairly when they're born. It doesn't start in the home. It starts in the home. If it starts in the home, it starts in the homes of the doctors and the nurses who are delivering children of different colors and see them as positive or negative, depending not on the color of that child's skin, but on the ignorance in that physician's mind. It starts in the colleges and universities. It starts in the elementary schools. It starts in the junior and senior high schools with teachers who do not realize that there's only one race on the face of the earth. And they've done studies that prove that the longer you stay in school in the United States of America, the more bigoted you become. Because the longer you are in school, the longer you are reinforced in what you learned in kindergarten. And what you learned in kindergarten was the rightness of whiteness.
Is there anything else that you'd like to leave us with, some final words for the audience and listeners?
White folks, you better get your act together. Number one, there's no such thing as white folks. Mm-hmm. I'm serious about this. Within 30 years, white people will have become a numerical minority in the United States of America. And the number one fear of white people that is expressed to me every time I do a speech is, if those people get power, aren't they going to want to do to us what we've done to them? If you want to be treated fairly in the future, you white folks, you'd better start treating people fairly in the present, because what you do in the present constructs the future. And black people never, ever, ever let a teacher, a preacher, a store owner, an employer define you. You are more than they will ever allow you to be unless you stand up and say, no. Number one, you're not going to teach me that Jesus was white, because he wasn't. And you're not going to teach me that you and I are members of different races. We're all members of the same race. And white folks, you wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for black people, the first modern human beings who appeared on this earth, changing their color as they moved away from the equator and creating you. So let's get over this idea of several different races and start to live like educated human beings, not like trained and coached people, but educated people who know the truth. It's time to start telling the truth.
Mrs. Elliott, thank you so much. And please tell us where we can find your book. Is it available on all platforms, and where can we purchase that?
Send an email to my daughter at jane@janeelliott.com and order a book. She'll be tickled to death, and so will I. I'll be pleased if you buy my book. And if you buy them from her, they are autographed. I signed 150 books this week just because my daughter told me to. Yeah. I do what my daughter tells me to do.
Thank you so much for taking time out to just speak with us and just sharing your knowledge and wisdom. It was really a pleasure.
Look, you and I know that every black woman in the country has forgotten more since breakfast about racism than I ever will. But what we don't know is the history of racism and how it is still affecting our lives and why that happened. If you have a constitution that says that a black person is 3/5 of a person in this country, you need to start there and fix it. We need to fix the education that we're offering in this country. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Again, everybody, you can go find her book, A Collar in My Pocket, on absolutely anywhere, really. And order it personally. She said you got 150 signed copies, so they're going to run out fast, I'm sure. But Mrs. Elliott, thank you so much.